this COP has been very, very different from many previous ones. So people are calling it historic. The very first day of the COP28, when the decision on the operationalization of loss and damage fund was achieved, that is unprecedented. It has never happened in the history of any COP where you take a major decision on the very first day of the COP itself. Yes, historic, but flawed in so many ways. We did not get everything that we wanted. For example, the linkage to say a scale was not there. So there was no reference to how much money is actually needed. And then there are also challenges related to capitalization, how we are going to be raising the initial billions of dollars to start transferring it to developing countries.
According to IMF report, around 17 countries are, living under debt distress. You just mentioned about just and equitable terms as well in that. How do you see it, how that is going to happen in those countries?
Core issue is finance. And unless and until we provide substantive support to developing countries to make that transition, and especially as you mentioned, they are facing debt distress, they will not be able to do that.
Hi everyone, this is Maryam Shabbir, and today we are going to talk about Conference of Paris COP28, which ended on December 13th in Dubai, UAE. And it has lots of important outcomes, and it was, so to say, very luxurious venue, one of the venue where lots of energies of lots of observers and parties were wasted walking outside the venue and getting to the venue where we wanted to attend events and participate. But that debate aside, today we have invited Harjeet Singh, who is head global political strategy at CAN International. And he's also Global Engagement Director at Fossil Treaty. Thank you so much, Harjeet, for joining us today. COP28, a lot happened, and in many ways, COPs are always controversial too when it comes to negotiations and also other arrangements. But most of the this COP was important in a way that global stock take was, kind of success, and global stock take is, for the viewers, it's a kind of document or kind of evaluation or make yourself accountable related to climate actions and what kind of support is there, for every country. Is that. And the second most important outcome was that was the first week of COP28, and that was huge success, so to say, the establishment of loss and damage fund that was finalized. Harjeet, I wanted to take your comments on that how, that is going to happen actually, practically, how countries are contributing funds to it so far, and how those funds would be distributed among developing countries.
Thank you, Maryam. Pleasure to join you again. This COP has been very, very different from many previous ones. So people are calling it historic. I can say yes, historic, but flawed. In so many ways. No doubt, the very first day of the COP28, when the decision on the operationalization of loss and damage fund was achieved, that is unprecedented. It has never happened in the history of any COP where you take a major decision on the very first day of the COP itself. In fact, there is a saying that nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. So for the issue of loss and damage to be seen as a standalone issue and not being part of a bargaining process and the normal trading that happens between issues, I think that was very significant. And so that also shows the kind of political momentum that was generated over the last few years. So the pressure coming from civil society and governments that actually created this kind of a situation. And also credit should go to the UAE presidency for prioritizing it. And they wanted to start on a positive note, and which did help. So from that perspective, it was quite significant. Of course, we did not get everything that we wanted. For example, the linkage to say a scale was not there. So there was no reference to how much money is actually needed. In fact, developing countries insisted for $100 billion annually by 2030. That was not included. Estimates say that we need $290 to $580 billion annually for developing countries. There was no reference to that study. So from that perspective, there is a problem because we don't want this fund to be just another fund with some $1 million. It's not going to help. Of course, we got about $790 million by now committed by developed countries to support recovery from climate disasters. But this doesn't really go far enough. As I just said, the scale is massive. And then there are also challenges related to capitalization and how we are going to be raising the initial billions of dollars to start transferring it to developing countries. At the same time, the replenishment cycle is for 4 years, which some of us think is a very long period to actually fill the fund. So yes, so we've got the fund, and now we need to make sure that it reaches a level which is commensurate to the need. So yeah, that way we have got a lot of work to do going forward.
Another major key takeaway from COP28 was the terminology on fossil fuels, which was like transitioning away from fossil fuels by 2050. How do you see it among developing versus developed world when it comes to transitioning away with this term?
So we as civil society were very clear right from the beginning when it was announced that UAE is going to be hosting COP28. Now, it being a petro state, we wanted to make sure that this becomes the key issue for COP28. And of course, momentum has been building for quite some time. For the first time, we got a mention of fossil fuels at COP26 in 2021. It wasn't enough. It was only mainly referring to coal, and the fossil fuel was mentioned in reference to subsidies. And that too, the language was very weak. So we kept campaigning, and eventually we got this language of transitioning away from fossil fuels. Of course, we wanted a language on phasing out fossil fuels, which is far more robust and specific. But the language transitioning away also gives a very clear indication that eventually we need to be moving away from fossil fuels towards renewable energy. And that's what we need. And that also builds on some of the discussions that have happened so far, or decision taken at G20, that we are going to be tripling the renewable energy by 2030 and even doubling the energy efficiency. So in a way, we are walking in the right direction. But the reason we say it's a flawed decision because there's a language on abatement of fossil fuels. It also refers to nuclear, which we know is a risky technology. It also talks about carbon removal, which we know is unproven, and you cannot rely on that. So there are those loopholes, or we call them dangerous distractions, which can dilute the decision that was taken to transition away from fossil fuels. But where we succeeded as developing countries to have a language which says a just, orderly, and equitable transition, which is extremely important for developing countries because they are not the ones who have caused the climate crisis. And rich countries have to do more domestically, but they also have to provide resources. So we have got that language. And there's also a specific reference to coal where it talks about phasing down without any specific target. So it's a weak language. But the pressure came from developing countries such as Pakistan, India, South Africa, Indonesia, where they felt there was an undue pressure on coal while rich countries continue to expand oil and gas in their backyard to the extent that 5 rich countries are going to be the leaders in expanding fossil fuels to the tune of more than 50% between now and 2050. So that's why the text was balanced, so that it covers all fossil fuels, and the pressure must remain on rich countries to do more.
Harjit, you just mentioned about a tripling of renewables energy by 2050. According to IMF report, around 70 countries are, living under debt distress. So you just mentioned about just and equitable terms as well in that. How do you see it, how that is going to happen in those countries? And that also includes Pakistan and a lot of other countries as well in that.
So, Mariam, the core issue is finance. And unless and until we provide substantive support to developing countries to make that transition, and especially as you mentioned, they are facing debt distress, they will not be able to do that. And it is therefore important that rich countries move away from lip service and actually deliver finance. The scene on finance is pretty bad. We've got so-called $100 billion target kind of agreed. That's what rich countries are claiming. But we know that majority of that, more than 70%, remains loans, which adds to the debt distress, as you just mentioned. And if developing countries do not get adequate financial support, they'll not be able to make that transition at a pace at which it's needed. So, and there was hardly any progress on finance. Next year, of course, is critical because the conversation on new collective quantified goal, which is a new target of the $100 billion that was agreed, which should be far more realistic, must be agreed. But the way rich countries are overly relying on private sector, which has not actually delivered, it's not going to help. And particularly on the issues of adaptation and loss and damage, you can't look to market. Markets have failed to provide that kind of support, even on mitigation, where it makes some business sense for them to invest. So the situation of finance is really bleak.
You just mentioned about adaptation. So one of the important key takeaway from COP28 is also like global goal on adaptation. You were just discussing about finances. So how do you see this happening? Like how that is going to happen, especially for developing world, and how do you see the developed world acting on it?
So again, this COP was quite significant also for the issue of adaptation. So our 2-year work program to develop global goal on adaptation was concluded at COP28. We wanted to have specific targets related to enhancing food security or how to deal with hazards related to water and the insecurity that we are facing, or even infrastructure loss that we see. But the adaptation goals that have targets that have been agreed are not specific enough, which can be measured. So we have got those targets, but not robust enough to measure. So what has also been agreed as part of the decision that another 2-year work program is going to be now initiated to work on that metric so that we should be able to measure. Where it is really good is on the issue of adaptation cycle, which means that saying how countries now need to do assessments of various kinds of impacts that they are facing and likely to face, and how they need to develop their plans, how they need to enhance and strengthen their early warning systems. So there are some specific things. But again, if we don't get enough finance, then developing countries can prepare these plans with some support from Green Climate Fund as part of readiness, but they'll not be able to implement those plans, which means if they don't adapt, they will see more loss and damage, which we really don't want to see because we are looking at this continuum of climate action. We need to stay below 1.5. We need to be boosting our adaptation efforts. And if we don't do both, then we are going to see more climate impacts, which means loss and damage.
Absolutely. Now, more of the discussion in this COP28 was also around cut down the methane emissions. We know that this is the second most contributing gas when it comes to global warming after carbon dioxide. How do you see this discussion shifting from carbon dioxide and more towards like methane? We know that the discussion around carbon dioxide is of course there, but there's like specific paragraph related to reduction in methane emissions. So do you think that the developed world is trying to shift the focus from carbon dioxide emissions, because those are like short term when it comes to its consequences on the environment? By 10 years time, it will just dissipate. But the carbon dioxide would stay longer in the environment. What are your comments on that?
So yes, we have seen a lot of pressure coming from developed countries to get more and more developing countries to agree to methane emission cuts by 2030. And the reason developing countries are quite nervous because when it comes to agriculture and livestock emissions, which are linked to methane, and even use of coal in some countries where they are relying on that, or even gas in countries such as Nigeria, they are not getting that kind of technology or assistance to reduce these emissions. That's one. And second, agriculture and livestock are food security related issues. So imagine when rich countries can and must reduce their emissions overall, they are not doing it, but they are cherry picking some of these emissions, which are closely linked to food security issues or basic survival or access to energy. It is absolutely unfair for developed countries to do that when they have all the kind of technology and finance that's needed to reduce their emissions across the board, and especially as you said, carbon dioxide, which stays in the atmosphere for a very long time. No doubt methane is more dangerous. It's 80 times more potent than carbon dioxide, but then it is a short-lived greenhouse gas that in the atmosphere. So we need to be working across all greenhouse gases, at the same time looking at some of the needs and priorities of developing countries. And if they want developing countries to act on methane emissions, then technology and assistance needs to be provided, and not just pressure that we normally see in these negotiations where developing countries are not getting support, but only pressure to do more and more and increase their climate action targets.
Very well said. And how do you see this COP29? I mean, what are your expectations as a civil society organization representative, as a negotiator, and a face of developing world when it comes to climate change? What are your expectations and hopes, and what kind of preparation you would be involved for COP29?
So some of the achievements that we had at COP28 now need to be turned into real action. So we are going to be very closely following how Loss and Damage Fund Board is going to be set up and how it looks at various priorities to operationalize it in a manner where money starts going to developing countries. That's one. Global Goal of Adaptation, again, as I said, there's going to be a work program. So how do we engage and make sure it's far more robust in terms of its targets and metrics? And on fossil fuel, of course, the key issue remains that we have discussed we need to transition away, but how? Who does how much? By when? I think some of those things are going to be discussed, and that's where the importance of fossil fuel treaty is absolutely vital, because this is where the conversation must happen in a far more comprehensive manner, that what will happen to the workers and economies that are dependent, and I'm referring to developing countries, and what kind of support and international cooperation is required for them, how we can actually have a managed decline. So it's a lot about details on how that should be part of the next conversation. And of course, finance, which cuts across all the issues. And I can tell you, Maryam, that next year, COP29 is going to be the finance COP. And that COP has to deliver finance and not just paying lip service. Because if you don't provide finance, then the transition will not happen, or we cannot really help developing countries and communities to adapt or even deal with loss and damage. So for me, the focus is going to be on all the areas, but particularly looking at the issue of fossil fuels, on how countries are now going to take specific targets, and finance to help communities being more prepared and dealing with impacts.
Well, thank you so much, Harjeet Singh, for your time today. And ladies and gentlemen, the conversation goes back to fight for climate finance, and of course, everything around revolves around finance for developing world, of course. And we have still a long battle, and we have, I think, good team members, I would say, or good players when it comes to climate change. And looking forward to what, as you, civil society representative and fighter for climate change, will contribute to COP29 and what COP29 has for developing countries. We will come up for the next issue in next vlog. Until then, goodbye.